On Christmas morning, I found all my $50,000 worth of gifts stuffed inside the trash bin, hidden beneath greasy leftover turkey bones. And the sight hit me so hard, I felt something in my chest crumple like the torn wrapping paper stuck to the sides of the can, and for a moment I simply stood there in the cold garage, staring at the ruined boxes as if they belonged to someone else. Because surely no one who claimed to love their mother would toss a diamond bracelet beside a half-eaten drumstick or smear gravy across the lid of the new laptop I saved up all year to buy for my son. Yet that was exactly what Nathan and Emily had done, and the sting of it started burning before I could even breathe. I had arrived earlier than usual because I wanted to help them set the table and watch the kids open their stockings. But instead, I found my gifts wedged between plastic grocery bags as if they were trash from a stranger. And when I picked up the crushed velvet box that once held a necklace I bought for my daughter Lily, the clasp was bent and the chain was tangled like someone had ripped it apart without a second thought. And in that moment, the snow outside suddenly felt warmer than the home I had walked into. I stepped back into the kitchen hoping for some explanation, but all I heard was Emily's bright voice floating from the living room as she told her family that I liked to show off and that the gifts I brought were embarrassing because no one needed that kind of pressure at Christmas, and my son laughed the kind of laugh that sinks into your ribcage and settles like a stone. He said loudly that I should stop pretending to be wealthy because everyone knew my income was nothing special, and he announced it as if it were a fact carved into the floorboards. And although he assumed I was just a school teacher scraping by, he had no idea that for years I had kept a quiet job overseeing more than $24 million of district budgets, or that I managed things far larger than his mortgage payment every month. But I never corrected him, because I never wanted my children to feel small compared to me. When his cousin Andrew chimed in, asking how someone like me could ever afford $50,000 worth of gifts, I felt the eyes of the room shift in my direction, some curious, some amused, as if waiting for me to confess some foolish secret about saving coupons or borrowing money, and the heat in my face rose even though the air felt cold against my skin. Emily lowered her voice just enough for her parents to hear, but loud enough for me to catch every word when she suggested that I had probably dipped into early retirement money without understanding the penalties, or maybe even taken on debt, and she said it with the confidence of someone who had decided long ago that I was incapable of making wise choices. The children joined in with innocent cruelty, asking why I gave them trash instead of real presents, and I could not bring myself to answer because the words stuck in my throat and felt too heavy to form, and somewhere inside me a small part cracked in a way I could feel, but not yet name. I looked down at my boots stained with slush and salt, and realized I had been shrinking myself for years, trying not to disturb the world my children built around their own importance. And I had let them speak for me so long that they believed everything they created about me was true. My phone buzzed, and when I glanced at the notification from the bank warning me of suspicious activity on my account, a wave of cold swept over me that had nothing to do with the snow outside, and a single thought flashed across my mind with terrifying clarity that someone in this very house might have been trying to take more from me than just dignity. I stepped out onto the back porch where snow had begun to collect in soft layers, and the laughter from the living room drifted through the walls like something sharp enough to cut skin, and I stood there watching my breath rise into the air while I felt the familiar ache of being the outsider in a family I had built with my own hands. The truth settled in slowly and painfully that they never really saw me beyond what they needed me to be, and that they never once imagined I might carry more strength and more knowledge than they could measure. As I stood there shivering, I whispered to myself that they still thought I was a poor, desperate woman, trying too hard to impress them, but they had forgotten one thing entirely, because I had never spoken it aloud that I was the woman who controlled more money in a single fiscal quarter than their entire household had ever touched. And the moment I remembered that truth, something inside me rose with a steadiness I had not felt in years. When I finally drove home after that Christmas morning humiliation, the cold Milwaukee air clung to my coat, and the roads glistened with thin sheets of ice that reflected the yellow streetlights. And as I turned into my quiet neighborhood, with its rows of modest townhouses, I felt the familiar ache of returning to a life that my children had long dismissed as small and insignificant. Yet it was the only place where the noise of their judgments could not follow me. And the moment I stepped into my warm living room, I stood still for a long time, thinking about how I had ended up raising two adults who believed their mother was nothing more than a walking debit card. Milwaukee in winter has a strange way of holding both comfort and heaviness, the kind of stillness that makes you hear every memory more clearly. And as I hung up my coat, I let myself remember the beginning, the years when I thought my family would grow into something kinder than what it became. But the truth was simpler and sharper, that the roots of everything that had happened this Christmas had been growing for years without me noticing. I was 52 and divorced after 17 long years, married to a man who specialized in quiet cruelty, the kind that leaves no bruises for others to see, but wears down the mind little by little until you start believing you are smaller than you are. And leaving him had taken everything I had, not just money, but energy, courage, and the fragile pieces of confidence I still held at the time. I moved into a small townhouse on the north side of Milwaukee, nothing luxury but peaceful enough for me to rebuild my life, a place where the trees were tall and the neighbors minded their own business, a place that outsiders might call modest, but that secretly felt like safety after all I had lived through, and for a while I thought my children would understand the effort it took to start again. Nathan had settled in Wauwatosa with Emily, always eager to show the world how well he was doing, even when half of it was pretend. And Lily, at 27, drifted through weeks and months, without purpose, clinging to a boyfriend who gambled away their rent money and always needed one more chance. And although I loved them with a mother's heart, I saw clearly that they did not look at me with the same softness they looked at me with expectation, with entitlement, with a certainty that whatever they needed, I would provide even when they did nothing to deserve it. They both saw me as the gentle one, the dependable mother with the supposedly low income and the quiet nature, the woman who didn't understand the world as sharply as they claimed to, and they repeated this idea so often that they eventually believed it was true, that I was somehow less worldly and less capable. And I let them think that, because it was easier than constantly defending myself from their judgments. They never knew about my real work, because I never shared it, not out of shame, but out of habit, the habit of hiding parts of myself to keep peace, the habit of shrinking so others would not feel threatened, and it had gone on for so long that even I had started forgetting the magnitude of what I did every day. For years, I had held the role of senior budget analyst for the public school system of Wisconsin, a position that required meticulous planning and the ability to manage more than $24 million in annual district funds, a job that demanded accuracy, strategy, and resilience. But to my children, I was simply a woman posting attendance sheets or grading papers, because that was the story they preferred. And I never corrected it because I thought my silence would make life easier for them, easier for me. And now I saw clearly that it had only made things worse. My salary of $130,000 each year went untouched by their knowledge. The bonuses, the retirement contributions, the quiet investments I made over 2 decades that had grown to $880,000, all of it hidden behind the soft persona they believed was my entire identity. And as I sat at my kitchen table that night, the bitter truth settled in that they never asked who I really was, because they never cared to look past what they could take from me. I stirred my tea and let the memory of Nathan's voice echo through my mind, the moment years ago when he joked to his friends that having me around was like having a personal bank with no overdraft fees. And even though he said it with a laugh, I remembered how his eyes stayed serious, how he meant every word, how he saw me not as a mother, but as a resource. That was the seed of injustice I had ignored the moment I should have drawn a boundary, but instead swallowed the hurt and called it love, the moment I chose silence instead of confrontation, and the moment that allowed him to keep pushing until the disrespect became normal. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that nothing about this Christmas morning had surprised me. Not the trashed gifts, not the cruel comments, not the disbelief when they questioned my ability to buy anything of value, because this was not new. This was simply the loudest version of a pattern that had been building for years. Sitting in that small kitchen, I felt a slow shift inside me. Not anger, not yet, but a recognition that my life had two sides, the side my children saw and the side they never bothered to understand. And for the first time, I felt the faint edge of power returning to me. Not the loud kind, but the quiet, steady kind that comes when you finally realize you are not as invisible as others believe. I looked at the small stack of documents on my counter, the work I had brought home before the holiday break spreadsheets that held millions in allocations and projections numbers that shaped the future of entire districts, and I thought about how ironic it was that the woman who managed budgets larger than her children could imagine was the same woman they called out for being too simple to understand her own finances. That night, as the wind pushed snow against my windows, I said softly into the empty room that the time for silence had ended, because silence had become the reason they believed I would never stand up for myself. And something inside me stirred like the first spark in a long, dark tunnel, a feeling that told me I was not done yet, not by a long shot. The memory of that Thanksgiving hovered in my mind like a cold draft slipping under a closed door, and even though a month had passed, the bitterness of it rose the moment I let myself think about it, because that day had been the first real fracture, the moment when I stopped being a mother visiting her son for a holiday meal and became an easy target for whatever accusation made everyone else feel more comfortable, and it began so simply that I almost missed the shift when it happened. Emily had opened the front door with a too bright smile, and the smell of roasted turkey filled the house in a way that should have felt warm, but instead felt staged. And as I stepped inside, I noticed the gleam of her new jewelry in the light, the same jewelry she later accused me of stealing, although at that moment I was still foolish enough to think we might enjoy a peaceful dinner together. The house was crowded with members of her family who barely knew me, yet greeted each other with loud, familiar laughter, and I moved through the rooms quietly carrying the pumpkin pie I had baked that morning, telling myself, as I always did, that being invisible was better than being a burden, and for a short while everything felt manageable until Emily suddenly announced to the room that her favorite necklace was missing. At first I thought she was speaking casually. Maybe she had misplaced it. Maybe she had forgotten where she set it down, but then her voice sharpened and she looked at me with that accusing narrowness that told me she had already decided on the culprit before she even spoke, and she said that she had last seen the necklace in the guest room where I had placed my bag earlier. The room fell quiet in the way that rooms do when everyone expects drama and hopes it will not involve them. And Emily stepped closer, asking if I had noticed anything unusual. The question shaped to sound innocent, yet dipped in suspicion, and before I could answer, she said with a feigned softness that she knew older people sometimes got confused, and maybe I had picked it up by accident, thinking it was mine. A ripple of discomfort moved across the faces of her family, and someone muttered something about memory problems being common after a certain age, and even though they tried to smile, I saw it clearly, the assumption forming in their minds that I was a woman, losing her grasp on small things and then larger things, and I felt a tightness in my chest, not from guilt, but from the stunning disrespect of it all. Nathan walked in from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel, and Emily immediately turned to him, explaining that her necklace had gone missing and that I had been in the guest room earlier, and instead of defending me or even questioning her, he raised his brows and sighed, like it was another chore to deal with, then looked at me and asked in front of everyone if I had checked my pockets. I could have defended myself. I could have said that I would never touch anything that belonged to someone else. I could have explained that I had only gone to the guest room to put down my bag because there was no space in the hall, but the words slipped back down my throat because the moment I looked at my son, I knew he had already chosen the version of the story that was easiest for him to accept, the one where I was the problem and he was the rational grown-up dealing with it. Emily pretended to be gracious by saying she was sure it was just a misunderstanding, that she did not want to accuse anyone. She only wanted to find her necklace. And then she added in a tone wrapped in false kindness that she knew I had been stressed lately, which could cause lapses in attention and the humiliation of being spoken about as if I were not standing 2 feet away, pressed against me like a weight I could not shake off. Her mother chimed in, saying, "Accidents happen more often than we think." Her sister nodded sympathetically, and the entire room shifted into that quiet judgment that comes when people have decided who is guilty long before evidence appears. And I stood there holding my pie, feeling like the floor beneath me had tilted. Nathan placed a hand on Emily's shoulder and told her he would check around the guest room again, then turned to me and said with a grateful smile that I should not take it personally because I was family. And family forgives these things, and the casual certainty in his voice that I had done something wrong made something in me wilt. After a few minutes of searching, Nathan returned and announced he did not find the necklace anywhere, and Emily sighed dramatically, saying she guessed they would never know what happened to it. Then she walked past me, intentionally brushing my arm as if to say, without speaking, that she knew exactly what had happened and did not need proof. Dinner continued, but the energy in the room had changed. People spoke to me more slowly, as if they were afraid I might break. Someone offered to help me cut my turkey in a way that made my face burn, and by the time dessert came, I knew the story had already solidified in their minds that the forgetful mother-in-law had taken the necklace without meaning to, and no amount of truth could unseat that image. Nathan leaned toward me at the table and whispered that he did not want conflict on a holiday and that I should just relax, because being included in their Thanksgiving was a privilege. Then he added with a half smile that I should be grateful they understood my situation, and those words cut through me deeper than the accusation itself, because it was the first time I realized fully that my son saw me not as an equal adult, but as someone beneath him, someone to be tolerated, someone to be handled. I remember thinking as I walked to my car after dinner that the night air felt easier to breathe than the air inside that house. And when I closed the door behind me and sat in the driver's seat, I whispered to myself, asking when I had become the lowest-ranking person in a family I had built with my own sacrifices, and why I had allowed it for so long. The weeks after that, Thanksgiving slipped by with a heaviness that clung to everything I touched, and although I tried to carry on with my routines at work and at home, the weight of being treated like an unreliable stranger inside my own family followed me everywhere, settling into the quiet corners of my mind where old wounds and new disappointments began to blend together. And just when I thought the sting of that accusation might eventually soften another blow, arrived in the most unexpected way, sharp enough to make me question how deeply my children believed I existed, only to absorb their consequences. I remember the morning clearly because it began so normally, the sun barely rising over Milwaukee, as I sat at my kitchen table reviewing budget projections for the next quarter. The numbers familiar and steady, like a language I trusted more than most people, when my phone rang with a number I recognized as the bank's direct line, and the voice on the other end asked me to verify whether I had recently applied for a $9,000 line of credit. For a moment, I thought I had misheard because I had not applied for anything, and the representative repeated the amount slowly as if preparing for an argument, then explained that my application had triggered a fraud alert because of mismatched employment information, and that was the moment my pulse quickened and a strange coldness spread through my chest because I suddenly knew this was not a simple mistake. I asked them to hold the application and told them I would come in person. my voice steady, even though my thoughts were running in circles, and as soon as I hung up, I sat in silence, feeling that familiar tightening around my ribs, the same one I had felt in Emily's living room when the necklace accusation spiraled into a story I never had a chance to correct. On the drive to the bank, I kept asking myself who would do this, who would take my name and pretend to be me, but the answer formed before I even parked the car, forming, with a painful clarity that made my hands grip the steering wheel a little too tightly, because there was only one person in my life reckless enough, desperate enough, and entitled enough to believe she had a right to my financial identity. When I walked through the glass doors, the banker greeted me politely, then pulled up the application, and as soon as he turned the monitor slightly in my direction, I saw it. My name spelled correctly, my address, even my date of birth, all filled out beside employment information that did not belong to me. And on the bottom right corner was a digital signature that vaguely resembled mine, but lacked the small curl at the end of the W that I always made. And in that moment, I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes, not from sadness, but from the quiet devastation of realizing that my own daughter had used my identity like a spare key she could borrow whenever she lacked the discipline to manage her own life. I thanked the banker and walked outside into the cold winter air, where I immediately called Lily, and she answered with a sleepy, irritated tone, acting as if my concern was an inconvenience. And before I could finish asking her about the credit line, she snapped defensively, saying it was none of my business if she needed help, and that if I had been a more supportive mother, she would not have had to look for funds elsewhere. I reminded her gently that she had used my information without permission, that the bank had contacted me directly, because it was submitted under my name, and instead of apologizing, she raised her voice, accusing me of blowing things out of proportion, and then said the words that made my heart drop with a heaviness. Thanksgiving had not even touched, telling me I was too old to manage money properly anyway, and that it made sense for her and Nathan to take over my finances before I caused problems for myself. I felt breathless hearing my own child speak to me as though I were incompetent or fragile, and before I could process the shock, her boyfriend's voice chimed in from the background, dripping with condescension, as he said that poor people always get sensitive when someone tries to help them. His laugh carried through the phone, and something inside me tightened with a quiet dignity I had not known I still had, because even though I had survived years of emotional warfare with my ex-husband, there was something uniquely painful about hearing strangers mock my worth through the mouths of the children I raised. I hung up without arguing, a luxury I permitted myself, because I knew any word spoken in that moment would fall against the solid wall of their entitlement. And when I returned home, I sat at the table staring at the stack of bills waiting for me, thinking about how easy it would be to call the police or file a fraud report, yet the fear of seeing Lily face charges or legal consequences made my stomach twist, and so even though I knew she had done wrong, I took on the burden myself. I called the bank, requested the fraudulent account be closed, and quietly paid the fees and penalties with money I could have spent on something meaningful for myself, telling the representative I wanted the matter resolved privately, and when he asked if I was sure, I felt a wave of shame that was not mine to carry, but one I had grown accustomed to holding. That night, as I sat by the window, watching snowflakes drift in slow circles under the street lamp, I thought about how strange it was that the children I had once carried through sickness and fear had grown into adults who saw me not as their mother, but as a resource they could exploit. I felt the slow disintegration of the boundaries I had never learned to build, the way each small act of disrespect had chipped away at the foundation of our relationship until even theft could be justified in their minds, and I realized with a quiet bleakness that this was not an isolated moment, but part of a painful pattern, one where every attempt I made to protect them only deepened their belief that they were entitled to take more. As the night grew colder, I closed my eyes and let the weight of everything settle. The necklace accusation, the trashed Christmas gifts, the fraudulent loan, each incident, a heavy stone placed inside me until I felt I could hardly breathe. and yet beneath all that heaviness, a faint spark flickered the beginning of a realization that something in this family had been broken long before Christmas morning, and if I did not change my place within it, then the next fracture would crush whatever strength I had left. I thought the situation with Lily had finally shown me the lowest point a mother could reach, but life has a way of proving there is always another step down. When your own children believe your existence exists only to serve their ambitions, and only a week after I paid off her fraudulent loan, I received a text from Nathan asking me to come over because there was something important we needed to discuss. A message so curt and formal it carried the same tone he used with subordinates at his office, which immediately made a heaviness settle in my chest as I drove through the cold Milwaukee afternoon toward his house in Wauwatosa, wondering what new explanation I would be forced to swallow this time just to keep the peace. When I arrived, Emily opened the door with a smile so polished it felt more like preparation than greeting, and she guided me to the living room where Nathan sat at the dining table with a stack of papers, neatly arranged as if he were conducting a meeting rather than speaking with his mother, and the moment I saw his posture, I knew he had already made decisions without me. He started by saying they had been thinking a lot about my well-being, using that soft, patronizing tone people reserve for those they think are incapable of caring for themselves, and Emily quickly followed by explaining that it did not make sense for me to live alone in my townhouse, because it was too much space and too much responsibility for a woman my age, which instantly made my stomach twist, though I forced myself to stay quiet long enough to hear the full script they had clearly rehearsed. Emily leaned forward, resting her hand dramatically on the table, and said that the best solution was for me to sell my home and move into their basement so they could take better care of me. And before I could even respond, Nathan slid the stack of papers closer to me, saying they had already spoken to a realtor who could list the property quickly, and that all I had to do was sign the documents transferring the deed to him so he could handle everything on my behalf. I stared at the top page and saw the words, "Authorization and Power of Attorney," printed in bold letters, the kind of legal documents that if signed would hand over control of my home, finances, and future, and something inside me went still in a way that was both sharp and terrifying, because I realized they did not see this as a discussion. They saw it as a formality, a step in their plan where my consent was merely a box to check. Emily continued talking as if she were offering me a gift, describing how comfortable the basement was and how it would be easier for me to contribute my funds to their mortgage rather than waste money on upkeep for a place I lived in alone. And Nathan nodded as though everything she said were reasonable, even generous, and for a moment I felt like I had stepped outside my own body, watching them treat my life as a problem to be solved with their convenience in mind. I asked Nathan why he thought I needed him to control my home, and he shrugged in a way that carried years of unspoken disrespect, telling me I was getting older and making questionable decisions, and that it was time for him to step in as the responsible one in the family. And hearing my own son speak to me like a liability triggered a memory I had tried to bury of the day my ex-husband told me I was lucky he kept a roof over my head, a sentence that once shattered me and now echoed through my son as if inherited. When I told them I would not sign anything, the air in the room shifted instantly. Emily's polite smile dropped like a mask she was tired of holding, and Nathan leaned back, crossing his arms with that familiar, disappointed look he often used when speaking to employees who underperformed. And then he said the sentence that sliced through me with the precision of a blade, telling me I was becoming selfish in my old age and that a good mother would think about her children's future instead of clinging to a house she barely used. The accusation hung in the air, heavy enough to silence even my breath for a moment, because selfish was the last word anyone who knew me would ever use. Selfish was the opposite of every choice I had made since the day I became a mother. Selfish was what I had never learned to be, even when it would have protected me. I tried to stand and gather my purse, but Nathan placed his hand on the papers again, pushing them toward me with a firmness that made it clear he would not drop the subject easily. And Emily chimed in, saying it was normal for elders to resist change, but that eventually I would understand they were trying to give me a better life. And I felt my pulse thud painfully in my throat, because there it was again, the rewriting of my autonomy, the assumption that their wants were more rational than my reality. I told them I was leaving, and Nathan muttered under his breath that I always made everything harder than it needed to be. And as I walked toward the door, I felt a strange mixture of humiliation, anger, and bone-deep loneliness wash over me, because I realized that if they could sit there, planning to take my home, then trashing my Christmas gifts and stealing my identity, were only early warnings of how far they believed they could go. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face with a clarity that felt almost like truth. And as I walked to my car, I thought about the security of my townhouse, the mortgage I had paid alone the nights I had sat at that kitchen table, planning budgets and repairs, the quiet sanctuary that home represented after years of emotional survival, and the idea of losing it, not to misfortune, but to the entitled decisions of my own children, sent a tremor through my hands as I unlocked my car. I sat there for a long moment, staring through the windshield at the light snow beginning to fall over the neighborhood, realizing for the first time that my safety was no longer guaranteed, even among the people who should have protected it. And in that stillness, an unsettling truth settled into place, that if I did not begin guarding myself with the same diligence I used to guard the budgets of an entire school district, then I would lose more than my home. I would lose the final pieces of myself I had fought to rebuild after leaving my ex-husband. As I drove away, their house grew smaller in my rearview mirror, and although the road ahead was blurred by snowfall, a subtle resolve began rising quietly beneath the grief, the early shape of a boundary I had never allowed myself to build, and for the first time in years, I found myself considering the idea that protecting my life might require protecting it even from my own children. The drive home after Nathan tried to take my house felt like moving through a world made of glass, where anything could fracture with the slightest pressure, and by the time I pulled into my townhouse, the December sky had already shifted into that deep blue that comes right before full darkness, the kind that presses down on you until your breath grows shallow, and I remember walking inside feeling hollowed out in a way I had not felt since the early years of my divorce, when silence could feel louder than shouting, and for the next 2 days I moved like someone operating on instinct alone, cleaning the kitchen even when it was already clean, folding laundry. I had just folded, adjusting the thermostat and then adjusting it again as if staying busy could keep the truth from settling in, because facing the possibility that my own children wanted control of my life required a courage I had not yet found. On the night of December 21st, the cold was sharp enough to make the windows tremble slightly, and I had just sat down with a mug of tea when my phone vibrated with an alert from the retirement system I use for my job, and at first I assumed it was an automated year-end update, but when I opened the message and saw the words, "Suspicious login attempt detected," my entire body went still as if someone had placed a hand over my throat, and I clicked the link to the security report, then stared at the timestamp which showed the attempted login happened only minutes earlier. My hands trembled as I dialed the support line, holding the phone pressed tight to my ear, while I listened to the automated prompts, and when a representative finally answered, I gave my details and asked if they could tell me whether the login attempt was internal or external. My voice so thin it barely sounded like me. And after a moment of typing, the representative said there had been an attempt to initiate a transfer of $18,000 to an outside account, but the system flagged it because the security questions were answered incorrectly. I asked whether it was possible the attempt had come from someone who had my personal information, someone who knew details like my birth date or address or employment history, And the representative paused before saying it was highly likely the person trying to access the account had information that matched the file closely enough to get past the first layer of identity verification. And that pause, that simple hesitation, created a crack inside me that split open the quiet denial I had been clinging to. I ended the call and sat perfectly still in my living room with the soft glow of the lamp touching the edges of the furniture, and the reality pressed in with undeniable weight that someone had used the details of my life, my name, my identity, the very things tied to years of my work to try to take what little security I had built for myself. And as the shock washed over me, I realized with horrifying clarity that the only people who would know enough about my retirement account to even attempt something like this were the same people who had already treated my value as optional, my boundaries as negotiable, my stability as something they believed they were entitled to rearrange. My breath tightened until it hurt to inhale, and I grabbed my coat without even thinking, stepping outside into the cold, where the air felt sharper than glass. And I walked to my car because inside those walls the truth felt too loud to contain. And when I sat behind the wheel, I turned off the engine so the silence was complete, gripping the steering wheel with both hands because my body felt like it might fall apart if I let go. Snow had begun to fall in thin scattered flakes, drifting through the light of the street lamp, and I stared out at the empty street, whispering the same sentence again and again as the tears came hot and uncontrollable, whispering the words I never imagined I would say about my own children, that even my family wanted to steal the life I had bled to rebuild, and the betrayal cut deeper than anything my ex-husband ever did, because he had been cruel from the start, while my children had been the reason I survived those years, the reason I kept going, the reason I believed love could still anchor a life even after everything had been broken. I sat there for a long time shivering, not from the cold, but from the shock that kept pulsing through me in waves, remembering every moment of the past few months that now reframed themselves through this horrifying clarity, the way Nathan asked casually about my retirement fund as if it were small talk, the way Lily once asked if I ever checked my statements or whether I just trusted the system to manage itself, the way Emily had rolled her eyes and called me old-fashioned for keeping my financial documents in a lockbox instead of online, and the pieces suddenly fit into a shape I had refused to see, a shape that revealed they were not just careless, not just entitled, but deliberate. The snow kept falling and I could feel the cold settling into my fingers, yet I stayed because leaving the car meant acknowledging there were now parts of my life I could no longer ignore. And the truth was that this was the moment everything inside me broke open, the moment the last thread of denial snapped. The moment I realized my children did not simply disrespect me or misunderstand me, but saw me as an obstacle between them and whatever picture of financial comfort they imagined for themselves. And as I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel, letting the tears fall freely, I whispered the sentence that would become the turning point of everything that followed. The sentence that rose from the deepest part of my exhaustion and grief, that even my own children were willing to dismantle my life piece by piece if it meant gaining something for themselves. The snow thickened outside and the world grew quieter, as if muffled by the weight of what I had just discovered, and for the first time since this dark spiral began, I allowed myself to acknowledge a truth I had avoided for years, that being a mother did not require sacrificing my safety or dignity or future to people who no longer saw me as someone worth protecting. And though I did not yet know the next step, I knew with absolute certainty that this moment, this night of December 21st, was the point where I could no longer look away, the point where something inside me shifted from fear into the earliest flicker of resolve, a resolve so small it barely had shape, but strong enough to keep me holding on as the darkness closed around the car, and I whispered to myself that something had to change, and that if no one else would save me, then I would have to start saving myself. The night of December 21st stayed with me, long after the snow stopped falling, because once you realize your own children are willing to dismantle the life you built, something inside you changes in a way that can never be undone. And the next morning, when I woke up with my eyes swollen and my body heavy from a night of crying, I knew the woman who had silently endured humiliation, theft, and manipulation was no longer the woman who opened her eyes in that moment. And even though fear still curled tightly in my chest, I felt a new kind of clarity rising beneath it, a clarity that came from the realization that protecting myself was no longer optional. And so I sat at my dining table, staring at the last faint streaks of dawn across the sky before pulling my laptop toward me to search for something I had never allowed myself to look for before a lawyer who specialized in financial abuse within families. The phrase itself felt like swallowing glass, because admitting it meant acknowledging that the people who were supposed to love me had crossed a line that no child should ever cross. Yet the truth had already broken open, and there was no going back. And when I saw the name Frances Keller appear on the screen, with a description noting her work with elderly clients and survivors of financial coercion, I felt an instinctive pull, as if something in me recognized this was the person I needed. I made an appointment for the following morning, and when I arrived at her office, the air smelled faintly of coffee and winter pine, the kind of scent meant to make people relax, but my hands were clenched tightly in my lap as I sat across from her, trying to find the words to explain months and years of erosion. And it took only 15 minutes of telling her everything, from the accusations at Thanksgiving to Lily's fraudulent loan, to Nathan's demand that I sign over my house, to the attempted theft of my retirement funds, before Frances looked at me with a steady gaze and said in a voice calm but firm that my children did not see me as a mother, they saw me as a resource to access and control. Hearing someone else say the truth aloud cracked something inside me, and tears welled up before I could stop them. But Frances did not respond. With pity, she responded with structure, outlining step by step what we could do, what I was legally allowed to protect, and what my rights were as the owner of my home, my finances, and my future. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something close to empowerment begin to form beneath the grief. Frances said the first step was to restructure my estate so that no one who had harmed me could benefit from my death or my savings, a thought that made my stomach twist because no mother ever expects to protect herself from her own children, even through legal documents. Yet I nodded, and she pulled out a folder labeled Living Trust and explained what it would allow me to do. She helped me list all my assets, from the townhouse to my retirement account to the investment portfolio worth $880,000 that I had silently built over decades of frugality and overtime. And seeing the numbers written out on paper made me understand more clearly why my children believed I was an easy target. Because people who dismiss you never imagine you could be someone with quiet stability and hidden strength. When Frances asked who I wanted as my beneficiary, I hesitated because the names Nathan and Lily felt impossible to write. Their recent actions still cut too deep. But then another face surfaced in my mind, the gentle face of Mason, my 16-year-old nephew, the son of my late sister who had passed 3 years earlier, the boy who still sent me thank you notes for birthdays, who always asked about my day, who hugged me without expecting anything in return. And saying his name aloud felt like releasing a breath I did not know I had been holding. Frances smiled softly and wrote his name into the trust as the primary beneficiary of my newly formed $1.4 million estate. And seeing it written there gave me a strange sense of peace, because finally, the fruits of my life's labor would go to someone who valued kindness more than entitlement. After that, Frances guided me through revoking all prior beneficiaries, restructuring my accounts into a new trust-owned banking profile, and drafting updated directives that would legally block Nathan and Lily from ever accessing my finances or making decisions on my behalf. And with each signature, my hand trembled slightly, yet my resolve grew stronger, because each pen stroke felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been slowly stolen over the years. When all the documents were completed, Francis looked at me and said the words that would stay with me, that revenge was not the point of what we were doing, that what we were creating together was truth boundaries and protection, and those were far more powerful than any attempt to punish, and hearing that helped anchor me, because I did not want to become hardened or bitter. I simply wanted to be safe. Over the next hour, we set up practical steps, including transferring my year-end bonus of $32,000 into the newly created trust account, scheduling a meeting with a notary for the updated will and printing backup copies of every document so that nothing could be manipulated or questioned later. And as the printer hummed, I watched the pages slide out one by one, feeling almost unreal that this moment, this quiet signing of papers, was in fact the turning point of my life. When I returned home, I placed the documents neatly into a fireproof lockbox, then pulled out my journal, the same one I had used for years, to write down fears I never spoke aloud. And for the first time since the betrayal began, I wrote without shaking, without hesitation, letting the truth pour out of me as if my hand finally remembered its strength. And at the bottom of the page, I wrote a sentence that came from somewhere deeper than anger, deeper even than grief. A sentence that felt like a declaration of a new self taking shape, that I was not seeking revenge, I was reclaiming the truth of my life. And as I closed the journal, I felt the faint but steady certainty that for the first time in a very long time, I was no longer losing ground, I was rising. The days after signing the new trust felt strangely still, as if the world had paused, just long enough for me to breathe for the first time in months. And even though fear lingered at the edges of my thoughts, there was also a quiet steadiness growing inside me, a steadiness that came from knowing I had finally taken back something that belonged to me. And for the first time, I no longer felt like a woman standing alone in a storm, but like someone building shelter, one brick at a time. I spent the next 2 mornings organizing documents, placing copies of the trust into my lockbox, moving the bonus money into the new account, and informing the retirement system that all old authorizations needed to be removed. And with every step, I felt the invisible ropes my children had wrapped around my life begin to loosen. But clarity often brings consequences in its wake, and only 3 days later, I learned just how quickly a quiet shift in power could expose the true intentions of the people who once assumed they controlled me. Because on the afternoon of December 24th, only hours before Christmas Eve, my phone buzzed repeatedly with security alerts from the bank and the retirement platform showing a series of failed login attempts from locations that matched both Nathan's home and Lily's apartment. And even before I opened the notifications, I already knew what it meant that they had discovered something had changed. I just finished placing a tray of cookies in the oven when the doorbell camera lit up with movement, and out of instinct, I wiped flour from my hands and opened the live feed. And there, on my front porch, stood Nathan pacing back and forth like he was rehearsing an argument, while Emily stood beside him, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles were white. And the moment I turned on the audio, their voices hit me with a force that made my chest tighten, because they were not confused or hurt or concerned. They were furious. Nathan stepped toward the camera and demanded to know why his access to my accounts had been revoked, his face red and agitated, as he said he had tried to log in to confirm some things for me, only to discover he no longer had permission. And Emily immediately chimed in, shouting that I had no right to cut them out without warning, accusing me of acting sneaky and ungrateful, her voice so shrill it pierced through the small speaker. I stayed silent because I was seated on my couch with the phone in my hand, listening to them through the app, watching their anger rise with every second they realized I was not rushing to the door to soothe them, not justifying myself, not bending, not shrinking the way I had always done in the past. And Emily suddenly yelled that I had humiliated them by locking them out, and that she could not believe I would dare to jeopardize the finances of the family over what she claimed was a misunderstanding. The word misunderstanding felt like an insult, because after everything they had done, they still believed they were entitled to my life, entitled to my accounts, entitled to control. And Nathan slammed his hand against the railing before shouting at the camera that I was behaving like a selfish old woman who did not understand how the world worked, and that if something happened to me, they would be the ones responsible for fixing the mess so naturally they needed access. I kept listening in silence, my heart pounding but steady, because hearing their words through a screen allowed me to see their intentions with a clarity I had never seen in person. And behind the shouting, there was something else, too. Something almost frantic. The unmistakable fear of people who realized the resource they depended on might no longer be within reach. Suddenly, Lily appeared beside them, breathless like she had run from her car, her hair disheveled and her coat half-zipped, and the moment she stepped into view, she leaned toward the camera, yelling that she could not believe I would betray my own children. That after everything she had done for me, I had chosen to stab them in the back, and the sheer audacity of that sentence sent a shockwave through my body, because the woman who had stolen my identity and used it to take out a loan was now positioning herself as the victim. She continued shouting that if I did not give them access, they would not be able to manage my affairs when I got older, that it was irresponsible for someone like me to manage anything alone. And then she said words I will never forget as long as I live, that I was the most cruel mother she had ever met. Cruel. As if protecting my finances from being stolen made me cruel. As if refusing to sign away my home made me cruel. As if expecting respect from my own children made me cruel. My throat tightened because the world has a strange way of turning itself upside down when those you love refuse to see you as human, and as I watched their rage spill out across my front porch. Something within me settled, something calm and deeply rooted, because for the first time, their words did not sink into me the way they once did. They bounced off the steel I had forged in the quiet of that lawyer's office, when I chose myself over the people who mistreated me. They began ringing the doorbell, repeatedly pounding on the door as if they could force their way back into control. But I simply lowered the volume on the app, sat back on the couch, and listened to my own breathing until it grew steady again, because this time, their rage did not dictate my movements. It did not command my presence. It did not shape my decisions. They stayed for nearly 10 minutes, shouting, demanding, insulting, and when they realized I was not coming, they finally stormed off the porch with a chorus of frustration, walking back to their cars in the cold December air, unaware that the camera captured every desperate word. The moment their cars pulled away, I exhaled so deeply, it felt like something heavy had finally been released from my lungs, and in the silence that followed, I realized with striking clarity that for the first time, the power did not belong to them. It belonged to me, and all I had to do to keep it was remain silent, remain firm, remain unshaken. I closed the camera feed, turned off my phone, and returned to the kitchen where the cookies had just begun to brown around the edges. And as I pulled the tray from the oven, I felt the faintest hint of peace settle into my bones, the kind that comes when a woman who has been stepped on for years finally stands without bending, finally chooses her own life, finally recognizes that silence can be the most powerful answer she ever gives. The days after their shouting fit on my porch unfolded with a strange mixture of quiet and tension, like the world was holding its breath while waiting for the next blow to land. And even though their fury had shaken something inside me, I still felt the steadiness that had begun growing the moment I reclaimed control of my accounts, that strange calm that comes when a woman realizes she no longer needs permission to protect herself. But power shifts never remain hidden for long, and by the morning of December 26th, I learned just how far Emily was willing to go once she realized she could no longer reach my money through the usual avenues, because when I woke up and checked my phone, a dozen missed calls were waiting along with several text messages from coworkers and neighbors who all sent me the same screenshot a Facebook post made publicly by Emily only an hour earlier. A post accusing me of stealing from my own grandchildren, a post claiming I had taken the Children's Education Fund without permission and used it for myself, a post designed to humiliate me in the most public way possible. My hands trembled slightly as I read the words because the accusation was so bold and so manipulative that for a moment I simply stared at it, unsure whether I should laugh at the absurdity or cry at how easily she weaponized lies when her entitlement was threatened. But before I could react, the comments beneath the post began loading, and one cruel sentence after another appeared on my screen, each written by someone from her side of the family, people who had always treated me politely at holidays, but apparently needed very little encouragement to turn against me. They called me selfish, irresponsible, unhinged. They said it was always the quiet ones you had to watch. They said elderly relatives often got confused with money and should not be trusted to manage it. They said poor people sometimes take things without thinking because they are desperate. And as I scrolled through the growing thread, I felt the familiar sting of humiliation rise in my throat, the kind that comes not from guilt, but from being publicly blamed for something you did not do. The worst part was seeing relatives I had cooked for, hugged, welcomed into my home, now calling me a thief because Emily fed them a story that fit the version of me she wanted them to believe, the powerless woman too timid to defend herself. I set the phone on the table and walked to the window, watching snow fall in slow, heavy flakes across the street. And for a brief moment, I felt the old instinct tug at me. The instinct to defend myself immediately, to call her, to explain, to correct the narrative before it stuck, like it always did. But before that instinct could take hold, my phone rang and I saw Frances's name on the screen. And the moment I answered, she said she had already seen the post because someone had forwarded it to her. Her voice was calm, measured like the steady heartbeat of someone who had witnessed this pattern too many times before. And when I asked if I should respond, if I should issue a correction, if I should demand she take it down, Frances let out a breath and said the sentence that would shape everything that followed that silence is the strongest strike when the truth is already on your side. She reminded me that people who lash out this wildly are usually afraid of being exposed, afraid of losing access, afraid of the one thing they used to control finally slipping out of reach. And she told me that if I responded publicly, it would only feed the chaos they were trying to create. It would make me look defensive. It would give them more power than they deserved. But if I stayed quiet, the truth would corner them eventually, because lies always collapse under their own weight. Her words settled deep into me because silence was something I had always used as a shield, a way to avoid conflict, but this time, silence felt different. Not avoidance, but strategy. Not weakness, but precision. And I realized that if Emily wanted a public battlefield, she would not find me there because I was preparing a stage of my own, one grounded in evidence and timing and documentation that could not be twisted by anyone's performance. After hanging up, I returned to the screenshot and read it again, not with shame, but with a strange sort of clarity. Because the more I looked at her words, the more I saw desperation hiding beneath them. The kind that comes when someone realizes money they believe belonged to them has slipped from their grasp. I closed the app and turned off notifications for the rest of the day, refusing to give any more of myself to her spectacle. And instead, I focused on the preparations Frances and I had begun in the days before the gathering of documents, the printed copies of every transaction, the timeline of harassment, the compiled log of attempted account breaches, the recordings from my doorbell camera, and the trust paperwork that would reveal everything at the exact moment it needed to be revealed. That afternoon, I visited the small storage unit I had rented years earlier, a place where I kept letters from my sister, childhood photos, and thick binders of financial statements going back more than a decade. And as I sorted through the documents, I realized something that made my breath catch, that for years I had been preparing for a moment like this without knowing it, saving everything because some part of me sensed that one day the people I loved most would force me to defend myself using proof instead of memory. I collected what I needed, packed it neatly into a box, and drove home feeling the weight of the evidence in the back seat like a quiet companion. That evening, as I sat at the kitchen table compiling everything into a cohesive timeline, the comments on Emily's post kept growing strangers, piling on distant relatives, offering unsolicited judgments, and the more they spoke, the more they revealed their own ignorance, because not one of them knew that the education fund Emily referenced had never even been in my name. It had been opened years earlier by their own side of the family and contained a balance so small it would barely cover a semester of books, yet she had leveraged it as a weapon in a narrative designed to shame me publicly. But I no longer felt helpless reading their words, not because I was immune to hurt, but because I finally understood the difference between temporary noise and lasting truth, and the truth was sitting in front of me on that table in neatly labeled folders. As I reviewed everything one last time, I felt a flicker of anticipation rise beneath my ribs, not excitement, but certainty. The certainty that the public exposure moment Frances and I were planning would not simply clear my name, it would reveal theirs. It would show every lie, every manipulation, every act of financial exploitation, and they would not be able to hide behind performances or Facebook posts when the evidence was laid in front of them with a lawyer sitting at their side. And as snow continued to fall outside and the house settled into its quiet evening stillness, I realized that they had spent years believing my silence made me weak, but soon they would learn the truth, that my silence had simply been preparation for the moment the truth would speak for me instead. The air on December 28th felt unnaturally still as I drove toward my late sister's old condo, a modest brick building tucked between two aging maples, the kind of place no one would associate with confrontation or revelation. Yet that was exactly what I intended to create there. A space where truth would finally step out from the shadows I had kept it in for too long. And as I parked the car and carried the box of documents inside, I felt the familiar weight in my chest. Not fear this time, but a deep, steady resolve pulsing beneath everything I touched. Frances was already there when I arrived, seated at the small dining table with her organized folders spread neatly in front of her, and she gave me a nod, a firm, reassuring glance that reminded me I was not alone in what was about to unfold, and we spent the next half hour arranging the projector, scanning through the files. One last time, preparing every piece of evidence so it could speak cleanly for itself when the moment arrived. When the knock on the door finally came, it echoed through the small space like a warning bell, and I inhaled slowly before opening it to find Nathan, Emily, Lily, and 3 of Emily's relatives standing on the doorstep, all wrapped in heavy coats, all wearing expressions ranging from irritated to self-righteous. And the instant Emily stepped inside, she scanned the room with narrowed eyes, as if searching for something to mock her gaze, stopping when she saw Frances sitting calmly at the table. She let out a sharp laugh and said loudly so everyone could hear that it was adorable. I had managed to hire a lawyer, asking with a smirk if I had found a discount rate for elderly clients, and her tone carried the exact cruelty she always tried to disguise behind politeness in public settings, but I felt nothing. Not anger, not humiliation, only a cool sense of distance, as if she were someone I once knew, but no longer recognized. Nathan stepped in, next jaw-tight eyes flicking between me and the projector as if he felt danger hovering in the air, but could not yet identify its source, and Lily came in behind him looking restless, twirling her car keys in her fingers, and refusing to make eye contact with me. But none of them asked why Frances was there, or what documents were laid out, because they believed the story. They had told themselves that this was merely a conversation where they would scold me into restoring their access, apologize just enough to get what they wanted, and walk away triumphant, like they always had. I gestured toward the chairs and said we would begin shortly, and for a moment the room fell awkwardly quiet as they all sat down, glancing between each other in confusion. And when Frances finally stood, the energy shifted, the kind of subtle shift you feel in your bones before your mind can register what's happening. She introduced herself politely, calmly telling them she was present to walk everyone through a review of recent financial events and clarify concerns. Her tone, so steady and professional, it left no room for interruption, although Emily attempted one anyway, snorting that this was unnecessary because she already knew where the stolen money had gone, and those words hung in the air like smoke until Frances clicked the projector remote and the first video appeared on the wall. It was the footage from Nathan's garage on Christmas morning, the video I had saved without fully understanding why at the time, showing Emily shoving the expensive gifts into the trash bin, her face twisted in annoyance as she muttered complaints under her breath, and the moment the image appeared, Emily's entire body stiffened, her cheeks flushing red as she tried to speak, but failed, and not a single person in the room moved because the truth was louder than any apology she could attempt. Frances let the video play to the end before switching to the next file, an audio clip captured through my doorbell camera. Nathan's voice ringing through the condo as he called me a burden, an old woman, someone with no value. And as the words played, his face shifted from irritation to panic, a tightening around his eyes that revealed he finally understood he was not walking into a discussion, but an unveiling. Lily sank lower in her chair, staring at the floor as if she could disappear beneath it, and the tension in the room thickened until no one even tried to pretend they were in control. Frances moved to the next slide, a series of screenshots showing the failed login attempts to my retirement accounts, each from an IP address linked to their homes, each time stamped, each undeniable. And Emily's aunt gasped softly, while Lily cursed under her breath, twisting her hands together in her lap, like someone trying to keep from shattering. The room felt smaller with each piece of evidence, the walls almost closing in as Frances continued her calm, methodical presentation. And when she finally opened the folder containing the trust documents, I felt my heartbeat pound once slow and deliberate, because this was the moment everything would change. She announced that we would now review updates Diane had legally executed regarding her estate, and Nathan leaned forward quickly, his voice shaking as he said that if this was about money, they should discuss it privately, just family. But Frances did not acknowledge the interruption, instead, reading the document aloud, her voice carrying a weight that pressed into every corner of the room. She read the line naming the new beneficiary, stating clearly that all assets in the trust totaling $1.4 million were now assigned to Mason West, my 16-year-old nephew, the quiet, kind-hearted boy who had never once asked anything of me. And in that instant, the room erupted. Emily shot up from her chair, yelling that this must be illegal. Lily demanded to know why I would betray my own children. Nathan slammed his hand against the table, shouting that Mason was not even my child, and their voices layered over each other in a chaotic storm of outrage. But through it all, I remained still, watching them the way someone watches a fire burn through the last pieces of a structure that was already collapsing long before the flames reached it. When their shouting finally slowed, I spoke my voice soft but clear, telling them they had not lost their inheritance. They had lost the right to treat me as less than human, and the silence that followed was so sharp, it felt like the entire condo was holding its breath. Their reactions ricocheted between shock, anger, disbelief, but beneath all of that was a deeper truth etched into their faces, the realization that the woman they once controlled was no longer bending, no longer apologizing, no longer theirs to manipulate. And as they stared at me, stunned into silence, I felt something shift inside me again, a sense of finality, a sense of release, because the truth had finally spoken for itself, and there was no going back. 1 month passed after the day everything exploded inside my sister's old condo, and the snow in Milwaukee settled into that thick gray blanket that always seems to swallow sound, making every street feel quieter than usual. And during those weeks, I heard nothing from Nathan or Lily except for the occasional secondhand comment from a neighbor who had seen their social media posts, growing increasingly vague and tense. But I did not reach out because I had learned that silence was not only strength, but also a boundary that finally protected me instead of imprisoning me, and I chose to let the consequences unfold on their own without interference, because those consequences had always belonged to them, not to me. But consequences have a timing of their own, and on the final Friday of January, when the cold felt sharp enough to cut the air, my doorbell camera lit up again this time. Not with shouting or accusations, but with something far heavier. Because when I opened the live feed, I saw Nathan standing on the porch with his coat half-zipped and his eyes red like he had not slept for days, and Lily beside him with her hair flattened by the wind and mascara smudged beneath her eyes. And the sight of both of them looking so worn made something inside me tighten. Not with sympathy exactly, but with recognition, because this was not the face of entitlement. This was the face of collapse. I opened the door, slowly, keeping my posture steady, and they stepped inside without waiting for me to invite them, like people who no longer cared about politeness, because desperation had swallowed the last of their pride, and Nathan immediately sank onto the edge of the couch, burying his face in his hands, as Lily paced the room with frantic energy, her words spilling out too quickly to process until she finally forced herself to speak clearly. Lily told me the loan company had filed formal charges for the fraudulent credit application she had created under my name. And though I already knew this would happen, eventually hearing her say the words aloud revealed a kind of fear in her I had never seen before, the fear of someone who finally realized consequences cannot always be outrun. And when Nathan finally lifted his head, his expression was so hollow it startled me, because he was never the child who looked empty. He was always the one who looked angry, determined, certain the world would bend for him. But today he looked as if the world had stopped moving, and he did not know what to do now that it was no longer spinning around him. He told me the company he worked for in Wauwatosa had downsized, leaving him without a paycheck, without insurance, without a single benefit. And he admitted they were 2 months behind on their mortgage because they had been depending on access to my accounts to fill the gaps. And hearing him confess, this did not shock me as much as it should have, because deep down, I think I always knew they were leaning on a safety net. They believed they controlled, but hearing it spoken aloud created a heavy silence around us. Emily was not with them, and when I asked where she was, Nathan simply shook his head, muttering that she was staying with her parents until things settled, which told me more about their marriage than he intended. But I did not ask further because I wanted him to focus on the truth instead of deflecting blame. Then Lily stopped pacing and stood in front of me, tears on her cheeks as she asked if I would help. Not with attitude this time, not with the entitlement she usually carried, but with a kind of defeated sincerity that made my chest tighten a little. Yet even in that moment, I felt something inside me remain firm. They waited, staring at me, like children waiting for a verdict, and I sat down slowly in the chair across from them, feeling the weight of every memory between us. The arguments, the accusations, the manipulation, the chaos, the way they had thrown away my gifts, the way they had thrown away pieces of my dignity without even noticing the damage. And when I finally spoke, my voice was steady, slow, deliberate, because this was the moment the power dynamic would define itself forever. I told them I would help, but not with money. And their faces twisted in confusion before they collapsed into despair because they had expected a check, a transfer, a bailout, the same pattern they had always relied on. And when I told them that the help I was offering came in the form of truth, they stared at me like I had spoken a foreign language. I explained that they did not have a financial problem. They had a truth problem, a responsibility problem, a self-created destruction problem, and no amount of my money would fix the cracks in their lives until they faced the truth about how they treated me and how they treated themselves. And they stared at me in stunned silence because they were not used to hearing me speak with this kind of clarity. I told them I had arranged a meeting for each of them with the counseling program at the church near Lake Michigan, a program that specialized in financial responsibility, emotional accountability, and family repair. But they would have to show up themselves. They would have to sit in those chairs and speak honestly. They would have to learn how to rebuild without expecting someone else to carry the weight for them. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, processing the reality that I was offering them guidance but not rescue. Nathan was the first to break the silence, his voice shaking as he asked if the trust was still in place, and I answered yes without hesitation, telling him every document remained unchanged, every signature still valid, every beneficiary still exactly as written. And when Lily asked if that meant Mason would still receive everything, I said yes again, because the trust was never about punishment. It was about boundaries. It was about protecting my life from being drained by people who refused to appreciate it. Their shoulders slumped as the truth finally settled over them, the truth that their last safety net had been cut, not out of cruelty but out of necessity. And the silence that followed was heavy, but also freeing, because for the first time they were sitting in front of me as adults, not as children demanding something they believed they were owed. They cried, both of them, and I let them sitting there quietly until the storm passed, feeling a complex mix of sadness and strength, and something like release, because I realized I could care about them without letting them consume me. I could love them without being controlled by them. When they finally stood to leave, Nathan paused at the door, his voice raw as he asked if I would ever forgive them, and I told him forgiveness was possible, but access was earned, and the trust would stay exactly where it was until they proved they were capable of treating me with the respect I had deserved all along. They walked into the cold evening, holding on to each other like they were trying to keep themselves from collapsing. And as I watched them disappear down the walkway, I felt strangely calm, because their downfall was not something I caused. It was something they created through every choice they made, and my refusal to fix it was not cruelty. It was survival. The weeks after Nathan and Lily stood on my doorstep in tears unfolded more quietly than I expected, as if the world around me had softened once the weight of their expectations finally lifted from my shoulders. And when the lease for my townhouse came up for renewal at the end of February, I felt an unexpected pull toward change, not the frantic kind that comes from running, but the calm kind that comes from choosing. So I packed my things slowly, carefully, placing only what mattered into boxes, and letting go of everything that felt tied to the years I had spent shrinking myself to fit the version of motherhood they demanded. And by the first week of March, I had moved into a small condo overlooking Lake Michigan, where the morning light hit the water in shimmering silver lines that made me feel like I had stepped into a different life altogether. The first morning I woke there, I stood barefoot by the window with my coffee cupped between my hands, watching the soft waves roll against the shore, while the snow melted into slushy patches along the sidewalk, and the quiet was so complete it felt like a blanket around my shoulders, and I realized with a strange mix of relief and awe that I was breathing differently, slower, deeper, freer, as if my lungs were finally expanding in a way they had forgotten how to do. I began walking every morning along the lakefront trail, pulling my scarf tighter against the lingering cold as gulls drifted overhead and runners passed with polite nods, and with each step I felt my body unwind from years of tension, years of keeping the peace, years of bending in directions that were never meant for me. And I found a kind of comfort in the rhythm of my footsteps, the way the world felt honest in the early hours before anyone demanded anything of me. Life settled into a gentle routine that felt almost foreign, not because it was unusual, but because it was peaceful, truly peaceful. And after living inside so much chaos for so long, the absence of noise became something I had to relearn how to embrace. One afternoon in April, when the air finally held the first hints of spring, I got a call from Mason's school asking if I could come in for a brief meeting. And the moment I arrived, I saw him waiting near the office doors, with a grin so wide it lit up his whole face. And he ran to hug me with an excitement that hit me straight in the chest, because it had been far too long since I felt that kind of genuine, uncomplicated affection. He told me he had been awarded a merit-based scholarship that stacked on top of the trust funds allocated for his future. And the counselor explained that together, the support would cover not only his first year of college, but likely his second as well. And Mason turned to me, with eyes so full of gratitude it made my throat tighten, because he was the only young person in my family who had ever treated me as a person instead of a resource. And seeing him succeed felt like watching the universe return something to me that I had lost long ago. When he wrapped his arms around me again and whispered, "Thank you," in that quiet, earnest voice of his, I felt something warm settle deep in my chest, something I had not felt in years, a reminder that love is not meant to drain you. It is meant to enrich you. And sometimes the family you support is not the one you raised, but the one who simply sees you. In the months that followed, I did not cut Nathan and Lily out of my life completely, because despite everything, they were still my children, and the part of me that had carried them, fed them, raised them, still existed. But I kept my boundaries firm, strong and clear. A quiet perimeter they could not cross without earning the right to step closer, and the distance created a space where I could breathe without flinching, where I could speak without shrinking, where I could remember who I was before they taught me to apologize for existing. They reached out occasionally, mostly messages about counseling sessions or updates on their legal situations, and I responded politely but sparingly, offering encouragement, but never money, offering honesty, but never rescue. And over time, they began to understand that the version of me they once manipulated no longer existed, that the mother they took for granted had grown into someone they had never taken the time to know. Sometimes guilt would flicker at the edges of my thoughts, the old reflex of wondering whether I should do more, give more, fix more. But that guilt would fade whenever I looked out at the lake during my morning walks, the wide expanse of water reminding me that growth is not betrayal and boundaries are not punishment. They are permission. Permission to live. Permission to heal. Permission to stop carrying the world on your back. One evening in early June, I sat on my balcony watching the sun dip beneath the horizon, painting the water with bands of gold and rose. And as the breeze brushed against my skin, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened over the last year, from the sting of being slapped by betrayal in the smallest gestures to the quiet triumph of reclaiming my life. One decision at a time. And for the first time, I understood something with complete clarity, that age had not made me smaller. It had made me more certain, more grounded, more aware of my own worth. I whispered the thought aloud, the words slipping out in a warm breath that disappeared into the summer air. I am not getting older. I am growing up. And the truth of it settled around me like a soft embrace. A reminder that change is not something to fear when it leads you back to yourself. The first snow of December always carried a quiet sort of magic in Milwaukee, the kind that softened rooftops and blurred streetlights until the whole world looked gentler than it truly was. And on the evening I finally sat down to write the last letter to my children, the snow was falling in slow drifting flakes outside my condo window, resting lightly on the railings of the balcony, before melting into tiny beads of water that slid away, and for a long moment I simply watched the quiet scene unfold, because it reminded me how life has a way of moving forward, even when people refuse to, how winter always returns, but never in the exact same shape as the year before. My desk was small and simple, placed beside the window so the glow of the street lamp could spill across the pages as I opened a fresh sheet of stationery. And as I picked up my pen, I felt a weight in my chest that was not sadness or anger anymore, but something softer, something like the tender ache of honesty. Because writing to Nathan and Lily meant acknowledging every piece of the journey we had been through, the love, the hurt, the ruin, the rebuilding, and acknowledging, too, that despite everything, I still carried hope for them, not the naive hope of a mother waiting to be rescued by her children, but the grounded hope of a woman who had finally learned the difference between loving someone and surrendering to them. The first words came slowly, steady strokes on the page as I wrote their names, and for a moment memories surfaced so clearly I felt them as if they were happening again. Memories of their childhood laughter, scraped knees, birthday candles, all those small moments that once convinced me motherhood meant giving until there was nothing left, but I let those memories pass through me without guilt, because love does not disappear, simply because pain follows it. Then the letter continued, in the voice I had kept buried for years, the voice that finally understood boundaries were not failures but truths, spoken with compassion, and I wrote that I hoped they were taking the counseling seriously, that I hoped they were learning the difference between responsibility and dependence, that I hoped the world had begun teaching them what I could not teach while drowning under the weight of their expectations. And after a long breath, I wrote the line that had been sitting in my heart for months, the line that held everything I wanted them to understand, that if one day they chose to treat me with kindness, I would open my door to them, but the life I had built and the assets I had earned, every dollar, every account, every bit of security belonged to the person who had shown me unconditional respect, the person who had valued me without asking for anything in return, and that person was Mason. Writing that sentence did not hurt the way I once feared it would. Instead, it felt like releasing the last thread tying me to a version of myself. I no longer recognized the version who believed love required sacrifice at any cost, even the sacrifice of her own safety. When the letter was finished, I folded it carefully, placing it into an envelope with their names written in clean, deliberate handwriting. And as I sealed it, I felt a shift inside me, a closing of one door and the gentle opening of another. And I placed the envelope beside the small wooden bowl near the window where I kept things that mattered, not because I was mailing it immediately, but because timing is its own quiet force, and the letter would reach them at the moment it needed to, not a moment sooner. Then I rose from the desk and stepped toward the window, resting my palm lightly against the cool glass as I looked out at the snowy street below the flakes, floating slowly under the lamplight in a way that made them look like falling stars, and without even meaning to, a soft smile curved at the corner of my mouth. Not a triumphant smile, not a bitter smile, just a simple, quiet acknowledgement that I had survived something that once felt impossible to survive, and I had grown into someone I never expected to be, someone who was no longer defined by what others took from her, but by what she chose to protect. The room around me was warm and still, the soft hum of the heater mixing with the distant sound of the wind, and in that moment, I felt something I had chased for years without ever catching a sense of peace, so complete it settled over me like a blanket, and I let myself breathe it in without apology. If someone had told me a year earlier that I would stand here today feeling whole, feeling grounded, feeling unburdened, I would not have believed them yet. Here I was watching snow fall through the window of a life I had chosen instead of one I had been pushed into. And as the night deepened and the snow thickened, I imagined the viewers who would one day hear my story, women and men who had lived through their own quiet storms, people who had been dismissed, belittled, taken for granted, people who had stayed silent because they believed silence was love, people who carried pain quietly because the world told them that aging meant fading instead of rising. And I wondered how many of them would see themselves in the struggles I had walked through. So if you are listening now, if any part of my journey echoes inside your own life, if you have ever been overlooked or underestimated or made to feel small in the place you should have felt safest, then I want you to know something as clearly as I know, the sound of my own heartbeat. You are not alone. Your story matters. Your boundaries matter. Your healing matters. And if you are watching this from a kitchen where the walls still hold the echoes of arguments, or from a quiet room where you are rebuilding piece by piece, or from a place where the snow outside looks like a clean slate waiting for you to step onto it, tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what part of yourself you are learning to reclaim. Because stories like mine are not meant to be whispered into the dark. They are meant to connect us, so none of us have to walk through the storm alone.